Welcome. My name is Ed Brigham. I am the co-host for our event today about the creation and implementation of the 1974 Budget Act. We have a wonderful pair of presenters today, and we're really looking forward to this. First of all is Bruce Meredith. Bruce began his career in 1963 as a presidential budget intern, and then he was snatched up right away by the House Appropriations Committee, and he worked as special assistant to Chairman Mahon, and in that role represented the House Appropriations Committee and staff negotiations and in the drafting of the 1974 Budget Act. After the Budget Act was implemented, Bruce was responsible for getting things going and getting it started and set up, and then worked for 6 years as a senior staff member on the House Budget Committee. And then in 1981, went back to the Appropriations Committee staff, where he served in senior positions until he finished a total of 26 years working for the House Budget Committee and the House Appropriations Committee. Our other speaker is Dr. Alan Schick, who at the time the 1974 Budget Act was enacted was the chief analyst at the Congressional Research Service for budget and appropriations kinds of topics. And he had a very significant role in the implementation of the enactment of the 1974 Congressional Budget Act. And these two gentlemen also have some very specific views about the congressional budget process going forward that they're going to speak to today. But before I turn back to Karen to talk about the logistical stuff, and before we turn to Bruce and Dr. Schick, I want to note that both of these gentlemen have a very strong and significant relationship to AABPA. In fact, Dr. Schick was the very first person in 1977 to receive the AABPA Great Service Award. And then Bruce received the same award in 1981. That award is now called the Bloom Award. And these two gentlemen have been in AABPA events as speakers and panelists, and they both participated also in the 1921 online event that we had to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Act. And we're delighted to have them. We're delighted to hear about their personal experiences drafting and implementing the 1974 Budget Act. With that, I'm turned back to Karen Coons.
Hi, everyone. I just want to remind you to please keep your audio on mute. Please put questions in the chat. We'll have a couple of minutes in between the two sections for questions as well. So if you'd like to ask a question, then you could raise your hand, but preferably if you just put it in the chat, it would probably keep things going a little quicker. Bruce is going to start. The first topic is the origin of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, and Bruce is going to start us off with a discussion about jurisdiction. Bruce?
Okay. Major congressional legislation often is inspired by or results from a serious crisis. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 is a good example of that. It resulted from a serious budget crisis in the late 1960s. And here is how that crisis came about. President Johnson proposed Great Society legislation. Congress enacted it. Then Congress funded it. President Johnson proposed Medicare. Congress enacted Medicare. Entitlement, that is, mandatory spending programs and indexing began to flourish in the 1960s. Congress enacted several tax bills in the 1960s. Together, they reduced the revenue base by an estimated $50 billion. What else? The country went to war. Some suggested raising revenues to pay for the war, but Wilbur Mills, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, had other ideas. He said, the time is not right for tax legislation. Next, President Nixon came to power. He proposed a $1 billion revenue sharing program. The idea was for the federal government to share some of its excess revenues with state and local governments. Congress enacted the program as a permanent appropriation, making it automatic in future years. It also started the program with a special boost, a retroactive appropriation for $1 billion. This budget crisis expressed itself in three different ways. The first, the profile of a federal budget changed and the budget margin disappeared. The famous Senator Moynihan of New York was asked what motivated him to run for the United States Senate. He said it was the federal budget margin. Every year, as the economy grows, the progressive federal tax system produced a margin of revenues that are not already claimed by programs under existing law. The challenge of a progressive Democrat was to capture some of those free revenues for his favorite programs. Years later, President Ford repeated the calculation. He came up with a very different result. He complained to the American people that he faced a budget deficit before he even began to work on his budget. Estimated revenues were lower than spending from programs already enacted into law. Moynihan's budget margin had disappeared. There was a new profile for the federal budget. The second way the budget crisis expressed itself was in the growing anxiety of members of the Appropriations Committee. Imagine for a moment that you're a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds elementary and secondary education programs. Your prime rationale for increased funding goes right back to Thomas Jefferson. A democracy requires education of its people. Your recommendations for increased funding for education, however, are trumped by mandatory spending. Veterans programs, for example. The American people strongly support funding for veterans programs, and some of those programs are written into permanent law as entitlements. They occur without annual appropriations, or in some cases, mandatory appropriations for these programs simply provide required funding based on estimates of participation rates for these programs. Ultimately, spending for education programs is measured against the deficit. Veterans entitlement programs are not. As an appropriator, that does not seem like a fair way to handle the relative priority of federal programs. Moreover, you notice that mandatory spending giving an unfair priority for selected programs consumes more than half the federal budget, and it continues to grow. The third way the new federal budget profile expresses itself is through a debate on the serious budget crisis, which is a crisis of deficits, ever increasing deficits. The president looks up the Pennsylvania Avenue and he blames Congress. Congress enacted all those laws. And within Congress, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Wilbur Mills, sells the blame for the deficits using a unique argument. Deficits are really bad, and spending causes deficits, and appropriations cause spending. Therefore, the appropriators did it. The first congressional response to deficit crisis was initiated by the Ways and Means Committee. It legislated a ceiling on outlays. Since an outlay ceiling controlled spending, the House leadership asked the Appropriations Committee to manage the bill and report future outlay ceilings to avoid deficits. House appropriators quickly had other ideas. They quickly decided not to report another outlay ceiling. And why? Outlay ceilings are misleading. They're unworkable and they're ineffective. First, outlay ceilings ignore the impact of revenues on deficits. A slight shift in the economy produced losses in federal revenues far outshadowing any impact on the deficit through actions on appropriation bills. Second, mandatory programs commanded a far larger share of annual federal outlays than outlays from appropriation bills. And finally, advocates of particular programs got legislation enacted that exempted over half the programs in the federal budget from control by any outlay ceiling. They came to be known as rubber ceilings. But we weren't done with outlay ceilings. In 1972, President Nixon proposed a unique $250 billion outlay ceiling. It included the following language: notwithstanding the provision of any other law. This phrase struck at Congress's direct constitutional authority of power over the federal purse. House leadership and top committees agreed to reject that proposal. Wilbur Mills, chairman of Ways and Means, on the other hand, included Nixon's proposed outlay ceiling in one of his debt limit bills. The bill passed the House. The Conference Committee on the Debt Limit Bill, however, dropped out Nixon's outlay ceiling and established instead the Joint Study Committee on Budget Control. Here. The report of the Joint Study Committee on Budget Control included two key findings. First, appropriations enacted over the last 5 years reduced the president's budget by $30 billion. And that reduction was completely offset by authorizing committees who increased the budget by $30 billion over the last 5 years. The second major finding, the congressional tax legislation during the 60s reduced federal revenue base by $50 billion. So how did the House finally go about developing its version of the budget reform legislation? Enter the House Committee on Appropriations. Several top staffers at the House Appropriations Committee spent a day in the Senate on the Supplemental Appropriations Conference. On the way home, they stopped off for food at the old Carol Arms Hotel on the Senate side of the Capitol. Issues in the supplemental conference were not the topic of conversation. It was budget reform. Why? The House Rules Committee had just established a task force under Richard Bowling, the Democrat of Missouri, to develop a tax reform legislation. The Ways and Means Committee was already busy developing a bill to solve the deficit problem. The draft Ways and Means bill ignored the Joint Study Committee finding that the authorizing committees in the last 5 years increased spending over the president's budget by $30 billion. The Ways and Means draft ignored the Joint Study Committee finding that the appropriations process reduced the budgets over the last 5 years by $30 billion. The Ways and Means draft ignored the Joint Study Committee finding that legislation had reduced the revenue base by $50 billion over the last 10 years. So, how did the Ways and Means draft propose to solve the deficit problem? Reform the congressional appropriations process. Well, top Appropriations Committee staffers were so aware of the provisions in the Ways and Means draft. They wanted the debate on budget reform to include a bill reflecting the views of the House Committee on Appropriations. They took their concerns to the chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations, George Mahon of Texas. Chairman Mahon agreed with the recommendations of his staff. He laid down two conditions, however, to guide their work. One, do not focus on committee turf issues. And two, do nothing that would make it more difficult for the Speaker to lead the House. Gene Wilhelm, a semi-retired House Appropriations staffer, would lead the staff work on the project, and I was to assist him. Jamie Whitten, a Democrat from Mississippi, was the second-ranking Democrat on House Appropriations. He carried the member lead for the committee bill. A strong coalition quickly developed. Appropriations Chairman George Mahon partnered with Richard Bowling, chairman of the Rules Committee Task Force. They were supported by John Rhodes, a Republican of Arizona, and Al Cederberg, a Republican of Michigan. Both were senior Republican members of the House and of the House Appropriations Committee. At the first meeting of the Rules Committee on budget reform, several members offered bill language for the task force to consider. Chairman Bowling suggested the staff pull all that language together for the task force to review the next morning. That night, the staff director of the Joint Tax Committee called the appropriators. The Joint Tax Committee does the highly technical work of writing tax legislation for the House and the Senate. They're one of the most respected groups in the Congress. The staff director said Ways and Means would no longer be working on budget reform. They had reviewed the legislation that the Rules Committee members had submitted, and they saw that that package pretty much outlined the approach of Jamie Whitten's bill. Our coalition had worked very hard to develop a majority vote for the Whitten bill on the Rules Committee task force before the task force had its first meeting. The final work on the House budget reform bill moved quickly to approve by the House. It was supported by a uniquely small group of staff. Gene Wilhelm led the design of the bill. John Barrier in the Speaker's office dealt with interest groups. Larry Filson of the Counsel's Office was our scribe. He handled budget and appropriations jargon with ease. J.L. Cullen of the Rules Committee guided House consideration of the bill. So, how did the Senate develop its version of the budget reform bill? Senator Byrd was an appropriator, and he was chairman of a subcommittee of the Senate Administration Committee. He assembled a top staffer from each Senate committee and borrowed Herb Jasper from the Bureau of the Budget as a very effective staff director. He also invited Gene Wilhelm to join his staff. He was a House appropriator. Well, Gene was ill and asked me to pitch in for him. We did not anticipate that the Senate would act. Budget reform legislation was directed at President Nixon. He was losing popular support every day. At the first meeting with his large staff, Byrd pulled a public opinion poll from the inside pocket of his suit coat. Congress ranked lower than the troubled president. Congress needs to enact a white hat public interest bill, and this is it. Senator Byrd operated effectively as the political leader for the Senate bill. He also participated directly in the development of virtually every aspect of the Senate bill. On one occasion, he met staff on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock for a review of bill language. He began on page 1. He ordered out for food and approved bathroom passes. The meeting lasted till 8 o'clock that night. Now, reconciliation. What was the role of reconciliation in the Congressional Budget Act as enacted, and how did it become a major element of the process? Reconciliation in the Act occurred only if needed just before the fiscal year began on October 1. It was a part of the now discarded second budget resolution. Actions or inactions of Congress or the impact of economic developments on the budget that occurred after approval of the first budget resolution has sometimes had unacceptable budget impacts. The purpose of reconciliation was to direct committees to make any necessary adjustments in appropriation bills, entitlement legislation, or the tax code to conform enacted budget legislation to the profile of the second budget resolution. Now, successful operation of the budget process itself was central to congressional power over the purse. It followed that reconciliation could not be stalled or deferred by the 60-vote margin required by the filibuster. Approval of reconciliation in the Act requires a majority vote. So how did reconciliation become an integral part of the budget process that is used now? Wall Street called President Carter for the message, with the message that something must be done about the federal budget, and President Carter called Congress. Senator Byrd took the lead in developing a legislative response. He invited the leadership of the primary House and Senate committees to a conference. He also invited the Secretary of Treasury, the Director of the Office of Management Budget, and the White House Staff Director. The group met in the Senate office for a week to identify specific debt reduction targets. Food was ordered out and brought into the conference table. Nobody left the room during the day to conduct other business. When deliberations were completed, it was Chairman Foley, the Democrat of Washington, chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, that brought up a political problem. No chairman could be first up to take his budget reductions to the House floor. His committee members and the key interest groups associated with the jurisdiction of his committee would not permit that. Why cut only their programs for the good of the country? House Budget Chairman Bob Jimo of Connecticut had a solution. He suggested adopting a single bill under the auspices of reconciliation. Roll all the required revenue and spending actions into one House budget bill would manage, but its contents would be controlled by the committees of jurisdiction. No committee would be called upon to be first up to bat. The reconciliation bill reducing the federal deficit was enacted following the meetings of the Byrd Group. Critics are concerned that the reconciliation as it was used in 1980 and as it is used today is not at all what the drafters of the Act intended. The original Act, however, actually provides authority for Congress to direct changes in the budget process in a budget resolution conference report. The idea was that the budget process might be refined from time to time to enable Congress to better perform its duties. In 1980, the president urgently requested Congress to reduce the deficit. Congress adjusted the reconciliation process to enable enactment of a bill reducing the national deficit. That bill became a paradigm for an expanded reconciliation. The Senate quickly approved a budget reform bill, and the conference report on the budget passed unanimously in the Senate and by a 402-6 margin in the House. President Nixon signed the bill on July 12, 1974. He resigned from his office of the president on August 9, 1974. And that concludes my summary of the origin of the Budget Control Act. Thank you.
Alan, I think you're going to talk to us about the reconciliation impact.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how I get on screen, whether I have to do anything, but I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What Bruce described was not a crisis, it was a war. It was a very limited war between the appropriators and the financiers, the revenue people. And the Joint Study Committee report, which Bruce mentioned, actually was a ceasefire between, or truce between, those two warring parts of Congress. The problem was they were not all of Congress, that the Democrats in the House and Senate saw the Ways and Means Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Appropriation Committees as the most conservative committees in Congress. And I also would add, they were also the most bipartisan committees in Congress. They were appropriators, they were financiers, they weren't Democrats and Republicans. They checked their party IDs at the door. But Democrats in other committees, and Democrats control both the House and Senate. They controlled the House for 40 years in a row, and the Senate at times by a 2/3 margin. They were upset by this truce, by the terms of agreement, and that's when I got into the picture. My job was not to write the Budget Act, but to help make it passable. And I worked first with Richard Bowling, who Bruce has identified on the Rules Committee. And what it required of us is that we get agreement across the line, party lines, Democrats and Republicans, and among a broad group of committees. That's why I worked in the House. And when we finished that, I know I'm tooting my own horn. Two things happened that I remember 50 years later. One is Richard Bowling, that was in late 1973 when the House passed the Budget Act, told me right before he took the floor to manage it, this is the first time in my 25 years in Congress that I'm reading a speech read by someone else. He did so because, after all, he was not a budget person. He was a legislator. And so he lacked a bit of confidence, even though he's a very smart guy. And second, after the bill was passed, I wrote the committee report. That was in the House. In the Senate, we had the same problem. How do we get all the committees on board? And how do we get the Democrats on board? But there was one additional problem, which Bruce also mentioned, that is the role of Senator Byrd. He was not a budget person. He really didn't care much about it, but he cared deeply about the procedures of the Senate. What would be the impact of a Budget Act with all its provisions, special provisions on Senate procedures? And that's how this ad hoc task force led by Herb Jasper was convened. And we met for several weeks, day after day after day. I was the only person in that room who did not front for a member of a committee. Okay, I was supposed to be the honest broker in the room. It almost didn't work out that way, because shortly after the ad hoc committee convened, that was a staff markup, we can call it. Mike Stern, the staff director of the Senate Finance Committee, who fronted for Russell Long, who chaired the committee, looks at me and says, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" And I got up to leave, and I said, "I never go where I'm unwelcome." And fortunately for me or my career, the way it turned out, other people at the room said, "Why don't you stay?" And I then became quite friendly with Mike Stern, who, if you remember him, was a very serious guy. Okay. So the Senate marked up the bill. Senator Irvin was the co-floor manager of the bill on the Senate, but he had no interest in budget matters. After all, he was then chairing also the Watergate Committee, which was investigating Richard Nixon. That was a full-time job. But he was interested in impoundment. He was the leading crusader in the Senate for restricting presidential prerogatives and upholding those of the United States Congress. So Irvin made sure that what came to be Title 10, the Impoundment Control Act, was stapled together with the Congressional Budget Act. Okay. During the markup of the impoundment section, the original text read, "An impoundment is any action by the president or an executive agency that withholds or delays the expenditure of funds." One of the members of the committee pipes in and says, "Senator, what happens if the president does nothing, refuses to spend the money?" And without missing a beat, Senator Irvin said, "Let the bill read any action or inaction by the president or executive agencies." So the bill passed. And again, I'm simply remembering history. I wrote the Senate report and I wrote the joint explanatory statement to the managers. I wrote them for two reasons, because although the key issues were political, the bills themselves had to deal with budget matters, and some people thought I was an expert on it. And the second reason was because I worked for an agency called the Congressional Research Service. They thought I didn't have any axe to grind. So I wrote them. Then Congress passes it. The passage was memorable for me. Member after member called this a declaration of legislative independence. They saw this not only as resolving issues in Congress, but also cutting the presidency down to size. After all, 1973, 1974 was the aftermath of Watergate, followed by Vietnam, followed by Watergate. These two were twin blows to the prestige, the power, the authority of the president. Congress was feeling that it was timely for it to take control of the federal purse. Right? When the bill passed the Senate, I took my copy of the bill, went from senator to senator, got signed. I still have it in my office. Maybe 50 senators signed the front page. I went to the chairman, Senator Irvin, signed it and says, "Alan, everything could be okay because Congress will now have its own budget staff." And somehow I made the following statement to Senator Irvin. "You know what the Bible says about that?" I knew that Irvin was a Bible quoting senator. And he said, "What?" And I said, "And Jacob died leaning on his staff." Of course, afterwards I found out that was not in the Bible, but it was too late because the senator mentioned to everyone else. So the bill passed. And then as Bruce pointed out, it didn't work out well. There were two resolutions that make it twice as hard to vote on it. There was continuing warfare in Congress over the budget. In the House, during the 1970s and into the 1980s, the budget resolution passed only because Democratic leadership, the whips told the members, vote the process, don't vote the numbers. We have to pass a budget resolution because we'll look bad if we don't. Don't worry about the numbers. We'll take care of them later on when we deal with appropriations and other legislation. It doesn't matter what's in the budget resolution. Let's show America that we can pass the budget. And so that opened up a disconnect between Congress passing a budget resolution and Congress doing its other stuff. And that led to a process which is mentioned in one or two sections of the Budget Act, almost as a throwaway, something which we now call scoring. Scoring became congressional budgeting. How do you score a bill, a proposal, an amendment against what Congress is doing? Bruce pointed out that reconciliation, introduced for the first time in 1980, ate up the whole process. Nowadays, Congress passes a budget resolution only in those years where it wants to have a budget resolution. If there's no If there's no reconciliation, there's no budget resolution. Reconciliation got adopted because of testimony, you can look it up, in December 1979 before the House Budget Committee, which faced the following problem. The budget resolution says these should be the revenues, these should be the expenditures of the United States. But as Bruce pointed out, expenditures were driven mostly by permanent law, revenues almost entirely by permanent law. How does a non-law, which is a budget resolution, change existing law? The bridge, which I proposed at that hearing, was reconciliation. A year later, seeing how Ronald Reagan used it in 1981, much more broadly, I wrote a monograph for the American Enterprise Institute, whose last words were, reconciliation should not be a budget process for every legislative season. So these are the early years of the budget process. Okay. It's no surprise to anyone that the process did not work out the way we hoped. It wasn't simply getting rid of the second budget resolution. It wasn't simply getting rid of the functional allocations in the budget resolution. There was something much more deeply involved about it, and that is a breakdown of Congress. And we'll stop here because that will be part of the second presentation that we make. Thank you.
The second section is, Bruce and Alan wanted to talk about legacy failures and recommendations. Alan's going to kick us off this time to talk about it, to ask the question or answer the question, is Congress inherently incapable of being a responsible budget-making institution?
And I'll tell you the truth of the matter is that there are two answers. No, a lot of people say no. In fact, those in the audience who are familiar with what was called the Executive Budget Revolution, which began 150 years ago in Britain and then in France and moved to the United States. The assumption was a legislature, any democratic legislature, is incapable of being responsible and effective with respect to budget matters. They face too many pressures. They look to their constituencies, not to the total country. So that's one answer, no. The other answer is Congress can be responsible under the right conditions. Unfortunately, the right conditions have not been present the last 50 years. What went wrong? Just about everything that went wrong. And to begin with something, those of you who are budget wonks, go and get a copy of the federal president's budget in the 1970s and into the 1980s. They are financial statements. There's nothing the president did this. This is what we're spending on this account, this agency, this program, this activity, with explanation of what the numbers meant and how they were constructed. Okay. It was not a political document. Scroll ahead to the last 20 years of budget documents. They look like campaign statements. They're platforms. They're dead on arrival. The president is not speaking to Congress. He's speaking to a larger audience, the American people. That's important because even though the Congressional Budget Act emboldened Congress, it could not write the president out of the script. And Congress needs the president to make it easier for Congress to take the hard decisions. If the president is AWOL, if the president has a budget which is speaking to his base, okay, Congress cannot do its job. But other things happen. The extreme partisanship in Congress. It began in the House, then led to the Senate. Okay. Budget resolutions, not only budget resolutions, look at appropriations, look at revenue legislation. Those were the corridors of bipartisanship. I can tell you an example. In the 1980s, when Dan Rostenkowski chaired the Ways and Means Committee, every year he took all the members of the committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, on a 3-day retreat to a golf course in a warm state. Okay. And I happened to hitch along the ride. Okay. We spent a lot of time discussing issues, but the overriding purpose Democrats and Republicans should rub shoulders together. They should work together. That's gone. Okay. We have gridlock in Congress. We have a shift which began just about the time that the Budget Act was passed from committees to leaders. Okay. It used to be, those of you who look at old textbooks, as old as 30 years old, Congress was run by committees. Everybody quotes Woodrow Wilson in that matter. That's not recognizable in Congress today. It's run by the leaders. Okay. Committees are burial grounds for legislation today. They're not simply the preparatory grounds for legislation. We have the new filibuster. The textbooks still say filibusters are when people talk and talk and talk and talk. They got it wrong. The contemporary filibuster is when there's not even 1 nanosecond of talking, right? The motion to proceed fails. It needs 60 votes. Motion to proceed, you don't have 60 votes, you don't proceed, you don't talk. That's the modern filibuster. But if you want to know about the breakdown in Congress, you must look outside Congress, because Congress is the most porous institution in American life. It's hypersensitive to what's happening in the country. The 24/7 social media, which widens gaps between people. The permanent campaign. It begins the next day after the first Tuesday in November. Okay, the crushing increase of entitlements and the demographics which drive them, which Bruce talked about earlier. The budgeting and scoring, the decline of the United States of America. Okay, all this has made responsible budget different. So let me conclude by giving my take on the question that Karen asked. Can anything be done? Okay, pessimists would say only a political revolution. We have to change the political basis, the structure of the United States. Anything short of that will mean that Democrats and liberals and progressives are tuned into their social media, Republicans and conservatives are tuned into their social media, and the gap grows wider, the bitterness is greater, etc. The gap between the two parties is much too wide. Okay. That's the pessimistic thing. You don't change budgeting unless you can change. You don't reform and rebuild budgeting unless you rebuild the capacity of American governments. Okay. The optimists say America always has bounced back. Things go through cycles. Okay. And this is a down cycle in America. Okay. Okay. There's only one problem why I'm going to close by jumping on the optimist parade. Okay. The cycles we had in the past were seesaw cycles. The president up in one period, and during that period, Congress was down. Then a reversal. Congress was ascendant, and the president was weakened. Now we have a political system where the Democrats and the Republicans, and the president and the Congress, both of them are depressed. That takes a much greater bounce. We'll have to see whether America has that capacity to do it. Thank you.
Bruce is going to talk for a minute about the legacy of the CBA.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that one.
You're going to talk for a minute or two here about the legacy of the CBA.
The legacy of the CBA is scoring. I hate to say that's what. No, the legacy of the CBA is something really remarkable. The Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget, or CBO, was created to serve the budget process. The budget process fails, and the Congressional Budget Office is the most admired institution in Washington. The media fawn over its numbers. Okay. It's lived a charmed life. It's lived an unexamined life, if I have to say, though some would disagree. Okay. Its two most important decisions as a Congressional Budget Office. Number one, by Alice Rivlin brilliantly, we shall make no recommendations. She was the one who invented the formula. The Congressional Budget Office can be powerful, not because it jumps into the political fray and recommends policy, but because it stands outside and is the honest counter of what's going on. The second decision she made is every number that the Congressional Budget Office produced is measured against a baseline, and not against last year's numbers. I can't tell you, maybe Bruce will comment on how that was disruptive to the appropriations process. That alone has derailed the capacity of appropriators to do the following: increase above last year and below the president's budget. That was always the sweet spot for House appropriators. Less than the president asked for, more than last year. They can thereby satisfy two constituencies: cut spending and increase programs. Okay. When you score against the baseline, you're scoring against the increases built in. And when baselines were introduced, the appropriators mocked it. These are hypothetical numbers. We deal with actual bedrock numbers. What did the president recommend? How much was spent the previous year? Isn't it interesting that hypotheticals crowded out the actual numbers? Okay. CBO is soaring, but it's a small part of the story of making it even more difficult for Congress to function. Okay, thank you.
Bruce, you were going to talk to us now about the legacy of the CBA, the monumental failure, and recommendations to improve the process.
Yes, you gave my subject, so I'll just leap right in and say my first topic is the legacy of the act.
Yeah.
Power of the purse. James Madison said, "The power over the purse may be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people." Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat of West Virginia and the leader of budget reform legislation, had a similar view. He said, "The legislative control of the purse is the central pillar upon which the constitutional temple of checks and balances and separation of powers rests. And if that pillar is shaken, the temple will fall. It is central to the fundamental liberty of the American people." Preserving the congressional power of the purse was a driving force behind the development of the Congressional Budget Act. It was to ensure the position of Congress in our balance of powers government. The executive was asserting itself aggressively in federal financial matters. Congress needed to find a way in 1970 to responsibly handle the power of the purse, its most fundamental power under the Constitution. The vote on the conference report on the Congressional Budget Act in the Senate was unanimous. All but 6 votes in the House approved the conference report. It was intended to deal with the president aggressively asserting its dominion over the power of the purse, specifically given to Congress in the Constitution. That was the power behind its enactment. Put it another way, what led the House Appropriations Committee to take the lead in developing a Congressional Budget Act? Mr. President, don't mess with our appropriation bills. Chairman Bowling's message. During the House floor debate, Chairman Bowling emphasized one key point. Without a process that supports the power of the purse, Congress would eventually lose its place under our balance of powers government. If not the solution laid out in this bill, then find another one. Without that, Congress would become as weak as typical legislatures around the world. It would lose its place in the shared authority over the government. It would be dominated by the executive. Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, said to the President Carter, "Pennsylvania Avenue is a two-way street. We'll meet you somewhere in the middle." The act created institutions and enacted a budget process and a timetable. It created a mechanism for Congress to assert its position in our separation of powers government. The process is there to carry out Tip O'Neill's view of the role of Congress. And there's one big caveat. Congressional leaders must want to assert the role of Congress in our system of government. Impoundments, a key item to be discussed under the legacy of the act. President Nixon claimed inherent powers for the executive under the Constitution to impound appropriated funds. He acted aggressively on that claim, ignoring specific language in enacted appropriation bills. Various anti-impoundment bills were approved by the House and Senate. None were enacted into law. Impoundment was a driving political force for enactment of the act. Title 10 of the Act established an impoundment control system. It's based on a principle driven by Senator Sam Ervin. It takes a law to change a law. The Act, Title 10, also authorizes the General Accounting Office to enforce this provision when necessary. The third legacy of the Act, it established a budget process to match the growing role of the federal budget in a huge economy. When the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 was enacted, the federal budget was 7% of a $34 billion economy. Congress had no mechanism to formally consider fiscal policy or national priorities. It took no votes on fiscal policy or national priorities. What was needed? In 1970, Congress needed a budget process effective for a budget that was 20% of a $1.7 trillion economy. The solution was to establish budget committees and a budget resolution process that includes total revenues and total outlays. A national priorities debate was facilitated by a system of functional categories covering all activities of the federal government, a system used both by Congress and the executive. The budget resolution is a congressional budget. It establishes congressional fiscal policy and provides guidance to congressional committees to implement that policy with legislation signed by the president. The congressional budget resolution is not signed by the president. Legislation enacted under the guidelines of a budget resolution is signed by the president. Fragmentation of spending authority, the infamous backdoor of the Treasury. That was a fourth problem the Act tackled. Authority to commit the federal government to financial obligation had fragmented to include contract authority and borrowing authority and entitlements. Garden variety appropriations were reported by authorizing committees and enacted into law. Enactment of tax expenditures was a growing problem. Finally, conventional thinking did not connect revenue bills to deficits. Tax cuts were considered at any time, notwithstanding their impact or budgetary impact. Solutions: the Act closed the back door. It eliminated contract and borrowing authority. It directed attention on entitlements and tax expenditures, but not strong control. It focused on revenues by deferring House consideration of revenue bills until the budget resolution was approved by Congress. Solutions to deficit problems would now presumably include revenues. Providing professional budget estimates and analysis for Congress was a key legacy of the Act. The executive branch had an overwhelmingly superior capability to handle economic and budget information and analysis. A familiar cry was that we needed an office on the Hill to match the expertise of the Executive's Office of the Management and Budget. I must say that appropriators were somewhat sensitive to that characterization. They knew that the Office of Management and Budget did a lot of what Appropriations Committee did. They made decisions. What we wanted was an organization that would perform estimates. The Act established the Congressional Budget Office. It also added scope to the jurisdiction of the General Accounting Office for budgetary work. A key role of the Congressional Budget Office is to provide members of Congress with professional, nonpartisan cost estimates prior to consideration of bills. Under the old system, entitlement and revenue bill estimates were not available till weeks or months after the legislation was considered by Congress. Moreover, they were mostly generated by the committees reporting the bills and interested private sector groups. Another problem addressed by the Act was the timetable. Congress relied excessively on continuing resolutions. No appropriations bill had been enacted prior to the beginning of the fiscal year in the 7 years before 1970. Several solutions were enacted to give Congress a little more time to handle its budget business. The beginning of the fiscal year was moved from July 1 to October 1. A formal timetable was established for the entire congressional budget process. Political parties and committees now organize in the fall, right after an election. Under the old system, committees did not organize till weeks and months into the new year. Now they are ready for business on July 1. A major timetable problem was that House rules require enactment of authorizing bills prior to consideration of appropriation bills. A compromise solution was adopted to move authorization bills more quickly. It proved to be totally ineffective. An unintended legacy of the act is an understandable budget nomenclature, one that facilitates debates and decisions. The new nomenclature breaks down into the following 4 categories. First, defense discretionary spending is a category recognized by everybody. Domestic discretionary is all spending handled by appropriation bills except defense. The third category is all spending, mandatory spending in the budget, including entitlements. Finally, there's revenues. This 4-part breakdown of the budget provides a handle for discussing trends and possible solutions. It did not exist prior to the act. Reconciliation, an unintended consequence. Filibusters enhance minority power in Congress. Reconciliation in its present form provides a mechanism for Congress to enact major legislation if connected in some way to the budget by a majority vote. It diminishes the scope of filibusters to some degree, which require a 60-vote margin for approval and the power of the minority in Congress. It's worth noting that the congressional budget established a process that is workable. In a recent meeting celebrating the 50th birthday of the Act, Leon Panetta emphasized that during the first 24 years of the Act, its procedures were followed. What is necessary to make it work, he said? Well, it's strong leadership support. When asked how to deal with the situation that Alan has described so beautifully, how do we get that to happen now? He said it probably takes some kind of a crisis to develop a new motivation in leadership in Congress. An example from my own experience and how it did work: Treasury Secretary OMB Director, White House Chief of Staff briefed the top House committee chairman in the office of the Speaker on a stimulus bill proposed by President Carter. Now let's hear what our chairman thinks, said the Speaker. At the close of the meeting, he said, tell the boss that we think Pennsylvania Avenue is a two-way street. We will meet him somewhere in the middle. How did it finally work out? The president proposed $6 billion. The budget resolution targeted $17 billion. Congress finally enacted $14 billion. Okay, we're done with the legacy. What is the fundamental failure of the Congressional Budget Act? Partisanship. The act fundamentally failed to anticipate the role of partisanship in the budget process. The House Budget Committee vote reporting the initial first budget resolution failed. 2 Democrats and all Republicans voted against reporting the budget resolution. John Rhodes, a Republican from Arizona, and Al Cedarberg, a Republican from Michigan, both were members of the Budget Committee. They also were longtime champions of reforming the budget process. They came to Chairman Brock Adams during the lunch break after we took that terrible vote. They changed their votes to save the process. In the future, however, the chairman should expect no Republican votes to report a budget resolution under Democratic leadership. On final passage votes on the floor of the House, Republican votes rarely total more than 2 or 3. Now we come to my 3 recommendations for improving the congressional budget process. Tax expenditures. Interested parties are always circling the greatest pile of money anywhere in the world, the United States Federal Treasury, figuring out how to get some. My point here is that smart money in Washington these days focuses on revenue legislation as well as spending bills. A win is to change a few words in the tax code. That funnels federal money to your interested party forever into the future with no more effort from your client. That approach to acquire some federal largesse sure beats fighting every year for budget increases in discretionary appropriation bills. My recommendation: establish a regular formal review of tax expenditures as part of the budget process. Second, make the Budget Committee a leadership organization. Committees frequently worry as much about turf as they do about legislation directed at resolving national issues. What we need in the budget business is a leadership budget policy group. Membership should include only House leaders of both parties and chairman and ranking minority members of appropriations, entitlements, and major committee revenue committees. It is a leadership budget policy group. It is not another committee of the House. Budget education. Congressional budget organization, terminology, and practices are detailed and extremely complicated. New members of Congress often have no legislative experience. Others have state experience, but the organization and nomenclature of their state budget systems are often very different from federal practices. A handy Congressional Federal Budget educational website aimed at members and their staff would be very helpful to all. A final observation on the legacy of the Congressional Budget Act. Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed, Czar Reed, once said, "Great events do not turn upon one man." The House of Representatives was ready and ripe for a change, and the people stood ready to approve. What all the world wanted was easy to do. Remember, the Senate passed the conference reports on the act unanimously, and only 6 members of the House opposed it. A professional student of Congress remarked to me at the time, "They think they're voting for motherhood. What they're getting is a mother-in-law." And that concludes my remarks on the legacy and one huge failure and 3 recommendations for improving the process. Thank you.
That was really a terrific discussion. We're a little over time. So instead of taking questions, what I'd like to do is ask you, Alan and Bruce, if you have any closing statements, anything you'd like to conclude with.
I would conclude with just a heartfelt follow-up to the points that Alan was making on the need for the leadership and the followership in both parties of the House and the Senate to remember that their primary mission is legislation, not preserving their own power. I think that's where we're at.
Alan, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I end on a personal saying, the Congressional Budget Act may have fallen far short of expectations, but did damn good stuff for my career. You know, Bruce was already in the center of power. He was Chairman Mahon's right-hand man as a whiz kid. So he didn't need that boost, but that was a different story.
Alan, we look to you as the expert on all budget and appropriations issues. That's all I've got to say. Everybody in appropriations did.
Yeah. I tell my kids the 3 reasons why I got into budgeting. 1, every government does it. 2, they do it every year. 3rd, they never get it right, and therefore I won't be out of a job.
Yeah. I'll make one comment on that. I got into this business because I passed the exam for the presidential management internship, and I was out of the city, and I got all these notices of where would you like to work in the government when you get down here. And I had no bus fare to get down there, but I made a decision. I thought, the one place where policy and power come together is in budgeting, where you have a center of interest in a bill or power of any kind. It's always money is there. And so I accepted a position that handled budgeting with the idea that would lead me to a great career. And frankly, I never looked back after I got there. Oh, just like Alan.